Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today for the second event in the McMaster Dialogues series. These conversations serve as a platform to address critical global issues. Each session focuses on a global challenge that has been identified by the United Nations Summit of the Future. Today's conversation focuses on science, technology, and digital cooperation, areas that hold both transformative potential and significant risks. I'd like to thank Vice-Provost International, Bonny Ibhawoh, for moderating this important discussion, and our panelists for taking the time to be here today and for sharing their expertise. And finally, thank you to you all for joining us. Your commitment to engaging in these dialogues is critical to shape a more inclusive and prosperous future. And now I invite Bonny to begin today's discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone for coming. My name is Bonny Ibhawoh. I'm the Vice-Provost International for McMaster University. I'm also a professor in the Faculty of Humanities. So like David said, this is the second in the series of the McMaster Dialogues. The McMaster Dialogue is a forum intended to provide a space for McMaster faculty and thought leaders to deliberate on critical global issues. We started off with a conversation last year on the topic of international peace and security, and in today's session, we'll be talking about science, technology, and digital innovation. Just to set a tone for the conversation we'll be having today. We all agree that we live in very interesting times, a time of great advances in technology. We're in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution with significant advances in biomedicine, the physical sciences, and in digital technology. And all of these bring enormous benefits, whether it's finding solutions to curing diseases or solutions to climate change. We can agree that technology is impacting our lives in very positive ways. But we also know that with a significant improvement in technology comes certain challenges. Questions about the ethical use of digital technology, a growing digital divide, and questions of sustainability. Take, for example, the fact that it's been said that 90% of all the data ever created by humanity have been created in the past 2 years alone. And now imagine that. What will the next 10 or 15 years mean in terms of the kind of data that we produce? And what does this mean for sustainability and how we live our lives? So these are really at the crux of some of the conversations we'll be having today. And I'm very pleased to be joined by three very distinguished McMaster colleagues who know a lot more about this topic than I do. And I'll be glad to introduce them shortly, starting with Dr. Kari Dalnoki-Veress, who's a professor of physics and astronomy here at McMaster University and co-founder of Mesomat Inc., based here in Hamilton. Dr. Sarah Dickson-Anderson, professor of civil engineering here at McMaster and associate dean of the Faculty of Engineering. Welcome. And finally, Dr. Mike Wilson, who's an associate professor of health evidence and impact at McMaster University and the scientific director of McMaster's Health Forum. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for what promises to be an interesting conversation. So I'll start with you, Dr. Dalnoki-Veress. And the question is this. Your work, I know, at Mesomat really involves some groundbreaking technological innovation, cutting-edge materials you've produced in this company, and all of these have had transformative applications. What do you see as the most promising opportunity for technology in enhancing how we live our lives as humans, particularly in relation to the aspirations of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay. That's a very big question. So I think I'm quite fortunate in that I have my role at the university as an educator, but also as a researcher where I focus on materials and how materials respond to their environment. Specifically, I'm interested in soft materials. And then exploiting some of that in the company that we've created, Mesomat. And so I see materials as being, of course, absolutely critical to everything that we touch. I mean, if we think about we think about a cell phone, right? Of course, we immediately think about the data, we think about the chips and all of that. But even something as mundane as the glass screen on that is incredibly important. Otherwise, if you dropped it, it would crack a whole lot more often than it does currently. So materials touch us everywhere if we think about health applications and so forth. So I sort of see materials as underpinning so much of the technology that we have. Of course, materials have the opportunity to try to improve things when it comes to sustainability. If we think about even the materials that are used in wind turbines, for example, and how much flexing is required there for these materials to work effectively, but then also in health applications. So, yeah, I mean, I think materials just underpin so much of our technology.
Thank you very much. And can you speak about the possibilities and challenges of scaling up? Because I know at Mesomat, some of your research is experimental, but to have long-term impact on society, they have to be scaled up. So what are the possibilities and the challenges in this regard?
So scaling up these technologies is a huge problem. And the reason it's a problem is because what works in a lab does not necessarily work on a large scale. So you can make materials on your bench and it can have incredible performance. But then you have to think about how do you actually do this on a large scale? How do you make, I don't know, many, many liters or whatever you need in order to have something function? So that's one problem. That scale-up problem is very difficult to overcome. And then, of course, it also becomes a resource problem. So maybe the input materials are very expensive, very costly, difficult to resource, require maybe mining or whatever, and can have potentially negative impacts. So that becomes a huge challenge. And then another big part of the challenge is just because you have something that is innovative and is good and is maybe way better than something else, what is it that the market desires, right? So just because you can make it and because it's better does not mean there's an appetite for it. And if there's no appetite for it, you can have the best idea, it's not going to go anywhere, right? So that's a major challenge when it comes to these innovations.
Thank you so much, very insightful. So I'll turn to you now, Dr. Dickson-Anderson. You work in a critical area, groundwater security, which is very crucial to our daily lives and very important to human survival. How can technological advances in the spaces where you work enhance decision-making in terms of water management, but more importantly, in terms of sustainability?
That's a big question. So I'm just going to take a minute to get us all on the same page about water security. There's 4 elements to water security. So first, there's drinking water and human well-being. If you think about having sufficient water that's safe to drink for everyone, that's a human right. But there's ecosystems as well. We have to have enough water so that our ecosystems can deliver their services to humans and wildlife and nature. And one of those is provisioning fresh water. We can also think about water-related risks, and actually what's going on in California right now in the Los Angeles area, that is definitely a water-related risk. Drought plays a large role in that. So floods, droughts, that sort of thing is an element of water security. And then economic development. So we have to have enough water to produce our food, to produce our energy. But think about tourism and industry, and a lot of what we do requires water, and technology plays a big role in all of this. So we have technologies to treat our water to make it safe to drink. We have remote sensing to look at where groundwater is, so we know what our water levels are and how much we have to be able to irrigate a field. So technology is all over water security. I want to make 2 points about why the decision making is complex, because you asked about decision making. So one is that our water resources don't align with geopolitical borders. So who are the appropriate decision makers can be challenging sometimes, and oftentimes we have to collaborate across jurisdictions. The Indus Water Treaty is a good example of this. The World Bank mediates that one. And it has endured since the 60s, despite a lot of conflict between India and Pakistan. So there's a lot of examples, actually, of peace that is brought about by water-related decision and management. And then the other piece that makes it really complex is that humans have a large impact on the water cycle, but the water cycle also has a large impact on humans. And there's feedback loops, and so they tend to propagate. So if we think about, for example, the Asakombo Dam on the Volta River in Ghana, it was built and developed so that they would not have to rely on cocoa so much, cocoa exports. But the challenge is they displaced 80,000 people and completely changed the ecosystem along the way. So those two aspects make decision-making very complex. And so that intersection is where I think the technological advances are really needed. I think we need to completely shift the paradigm of the way that we model and think about these systems. The current state of the art, we create physical models of these systems. You know, where is the water coming from? Where is it going to? We often forget about the humans and the impacts there. So I think we need to develop dynamic system models that include the human factors, policy, all those sorts of things. And then that will, I believe, put decision makers in a much better position to evaluate a larger range of potential solutions. Perhaps think outside of the box more. For example, you know, do we want to have a water pricing policy, or do we want to have a conservation policy? So that's where I see the technology really needed to help support decision making.
You talked about the need to get varied perspectives to trying to address these solutions in reference to a decision making, which lead me to the question of interdisciplinarity. You led the McMaster Water Without Borders program with the United Nations University for many years, and that was a distinctly interdisciplinary program. You know, you're an engineer, but I also know there were people from the social sciences, humanities involved in that program. So what role do you think interdisciplinarity plays in effective decision making, particularly as it relates to finding technological solutions that have relevance for communities, that are culturally relevant, and that meet the needs of local communities?
Yeah, great question. So when we are trying to solve a problem, I think everybody comes with their disciplinary understanding and their disciplinary lens, which is wonderful, but can also lead to blind spots. So that's why it's important, I think, to include people from all disciplines when it comes to these problems. Particularly, you know, when it involves humans, everybody's different, and so we need all these different lenses. I can give an example of a community project that I worked up. It was an Indigenous community in Northern Ontario, and they had a long-term boil water advisory. They were looking at 3 potential solutions. One was to rebuild their drinking water treatment plant. Another was to have a pipeline built from the nearby town to their community. And the third was to do nothing, to just continue to boil water. So it was not an interdisciplinary team that first looked at this, and they chose to build the pipeline. And the problem with the solution that was chosen was that 30% of the community wasn't on the pipeline. So they still had no water. I really believe that had all disciplines been involved, potentially more than engineers, I think some social scientists would have had a better idea of how to make sure that all those community voices were heard, including the most vulnerable ones. I think those are the ones that often tend to get left out. And that brings to another point. I think when we're trying to develop sustainable solutions, we need to also hear from all the stakeholders and have them involved at all points along the way. So not just all the disciplines, but the people who are going to be accessing the technology and interacting with it.
Thank you very much. Quite insightful. So I now turn to Dr. Mike Wilson. You're the scientific director of the Health Institute, an institute that has done great work, Health Forum rather, that has done great work here at McMaster in the area of evidence. Your work in particular bridges the gap between evidence and policy in healthcare and society. And my question is, what do you think are the essential strategies for strengthening evidence infrastructure in ways that can harness, all these great things happening with AI, but also other digital tools with the goal of reducing health inequities, which we know is a reality both domestically and internationally?
Yeah, thank you. That's a big question. It's actually a really exciting time for those of us like me working at the interface of evidence and policy. So getting the best available evidence into the hands of decision makers, whether that's a government policymaker, a leader of a system, a leader of an organization or professional group, or citizens who need it to inform their own decisions or advocacy efforts. The work we've done at the McMaster Health Forum and through our work with championing the Global Commission on Evidence to address societal challenges that my colleague John Lavis co-led was that we need systems that are nationally or locally ensuring that many forms of evidence are informing decisions alongside local contexts. But to your earlier point about the vast amount of data, to clarify a problem in the policy cycle, you need data analytics, you need modeling studies, you need qualitative insights to identify solutions to address those problems. You need evaluations, you need modeling studies, you need, again, qualitative insights. Then you need to figure out how to implement those using behavioral science. And then you need to monitor and evaluate, again, generating more data and evaluation. So a big part of our focus is how do you meaningfully synthesize that evidence in ways that is going to be helpful for decision makers. And that's where some really exciting investments are happening globally and harnessing digital tools and AI to do that. Recently, the Wellcome Trust in the UK has invested £45 million, and the UK Research Innovation has invested £11.5 million, so about 100 million Canadian US dollars around investing in a global evidence infrastructure to try and take a more coordinated approach to synthesizing evidence. So there's a lot of moving components to that, as you can imagine. Policymakers need things really quick. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, my group at the forum had to adjust our ways of doing things to synthesize evidence instead of sometimes months, in days or weeks, to inform the next policy briefing of the next day, because things were moving that fast. And then we also had to figure out how to do that in a living evidence synthesis way to make sure that those results were continually updated so we had the best available evidence and the new stuff constantly incorporated into that. So that's very time and resource intensive to do, right? So that's where these investments are coming in and trying to think about how we invest in a coordinated evidence infrastructure so we have a suite of living evidence syntheses that address priority global challenges in the world around the Sustainable Development Goals. But then we also have those investments going towards the evidence infrastructure that's going to be now informing the work of the Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative globally. So we have 5 groups in that. One is working with kind of the demand side, so users and producers of evidence working together to identify priorities. But then where the digital tools come in are these data sharing platforms and reuse platforms so that we can study a question once and then use it to answer many things in different contexts. And then pairing that with a third initiative to think about how do we use AI safely and responsibly to harness that evidence and to synthesize it. And then the working group that I'm on is focused on innovations and processes and methods to make sure that the ways that we're pulling all this together are really helpful for policymakers that we're aiming to do it for. And then lastly, to make sure that capacity is shared globally so that that evidence synthesis infrastructure can be pulled on by, let's say, resource-constrained countries that may not have the ability to invest in a new evidence synthesis, but can pull that into their own local decision-making processes to address whatever their pressing challenges are of the day.
Well, thank you very much. So I heard from you the role of evidence producers. I also heard about how you're harnessing the huge amount of data to support decision making. But what I was wondering was how this all translates to the public. Decision makers often have to convince public audiences, their constituencies, civil society, to buy into the decisions they make. And I'm wondering if, as part of the framework of the work, the great work you do in the Health Forum, is to think about knowledge translation beyond the evidence producers and the decision makers to inform public audiences about what these data means for their well-being.
Yeah, that's really important. So evidence is one input into a political decision. People who make policy decisions have to balance many competing demands. Evidence is going to be one input into that. So our view is that this evidence infrastructure needs to be accompanied by other things like deliberative processes that pull together key stakeholders, system leaders, those who can champion decisions, who are then informed by that best available evidence, ideally packaged in a way that's easily understandable, actionable for policy, and to deliberate off the record, generate ideas for how to move forward. And I also think those deliberative processes with system leaders are ideally also informed by similar deliberations with citizens beforehand. So this is what we do at the McMaster Health Forum. We will often convene a series of citizen panels on a pressing issue, synthesize what we heard from those panels and analyze it, put that into the briefing note alongside the best available evidence, and have our system leaders deliberate about what they think can and should be done next to address whatever that issue is of the day.
Thank you very much. So I want to go back to a question that we kind of started off with, that, technology, innovation, and this talk about digital transformation has positive potential on our lives. But we also talked about the challenges. And I want to shift to public trust, because as you all know, we can have all the technology in the world, but if it is not received and used by people, then all that effort really comes to question. And we saw this firsthand with the COVID pandemic, with piles of vaccines sitting in warehouses and people just refusing to take them because of misinformation, because of lack of trust in science, in technology. And I know much of this resides with politicians and decision makers. But as academics, we also have a responsibility. So I think this is the question I want to pose to the panel, is how do we address these lingering distrust in an age of misinformation, in an age of social media, in science and technology, and ensure that it actually serves the people for whom these technologies are designed? And any of you can start that conversation.
I'm happy to jump in here. I think we see, for example, vaccine rates dropping instead of increasing. This is completely absurd. There is no evidence that proves that this is the right direction at all. And I think one of the big solutions to this comes down to education. I think we're fortunate here that we're in an institute that focuses on education, but I think that's what it comes down to, is that we need to have a populace that's really well educated. That's the only way that we can solve these problems. I mean, we see right now, a fear of the elites. I mean, what does that mean? Should we be listening to non-experts? I mean, that is completely absurd. And of course, this comes down to appropriate communication and oftentimes a talking down to people, which has been done often, right? And so I think education is critical, and proper communication is really, really important. Trying to explain things in ways that people can understand, so they can understand why it is that certain decisions are being made.
Thank you very much.
I agree completely, and I think the one thing I would add is the importance of openness and transparency. So ensuring that the data that you have and collect and that you base your decisions on is available publicly, that people can see it and understand it and interact with it, so that it's clear you have nothing to hide.
Yeah, a couple things to add to that. The misinformation and disinformation travels really quickly. So that's a big challenge. And when we think about pairing that with the best available evidence to try and counteract it, that world moves pretty slowly in comparison for the most part. And I think that's where the potential for digital tools and AI comes in, alongside our robust mechanisms for generating and synthesizing evidence to use that to inform our, whatever it may be, counter misinformation campaign. So I'm not an expert in how to use this, but using AI tools to identify the emergence of misinformation, but that having that paired with processes then to use evidence-informed approaches to counteract that misinformation with good evidence, right? So it's about trying to change people's minds with good evidence and using strategies that are evidence-informed. So our group, we've been leading a living evidence synthesis about the most effective strategies to address health-related misinformation. So we have that completed, and we're now doing a similar evidence synthesis about strategies to address misinformation related to political institutions. But that's only one side, right? So we need to be able to quickly identify and then act on the misinformation that's coming out to rebuild trust in our evidence infrastructure and system.
Yeah, right. I agree totally. We need to work towards engaging public audiences, which brings me to a related question. What you all doing, the work you all doing are aimed at addressing global challenges, whether it's healthcare information that will help us address diseases, spread of diseases and pandemics, whether it's groundwater use sustainably around the world, or materials that enhance human well-being. These are initiatives that require collaboration, but yet we live in a world that is increasingly fractured. Conflicts, around the world, geopolitical tensions, and we know firsthand that these kind of inhibit collaboration and cooperation, not just among politicians, but even among academics. I like to give the example of the International Space Station, for instance, initiated in the 1990s at the height of the Cold War. So even while the Soviet Union and the United States were at loggerheads at the height of the Cold War, the scientists worked behind the scenes to build this magnificent infrastructure that serves today the interests of the human race, the International Space Station. And so my question to you is, what role does multilateral collaboration have to play in addressing the kind of scientific questions that you address? And how do you tackle the barriers that exist to these kinds of scientific collaborations?
So I think that collaboration, at least for our work with this evidence infrastructure is at the foundation of what we're doing. And I think what's critical is an approach to open science, that an open and transparency in all of our activities, that we need to make the best use of the resources that we have. We need to show a cooperative effort in pulling together evidence to address the big challenges that we face on our globe, and do that in a really robust, transparent, open science way. I don't need to extract information from 20 studies about the effects of a policy solution when another team in Germany or the UK has already do that. Our goal is to make that open so that someone else can use that, add to it, and continue to contribute to that more collaborative and open environment.
I spoke about it a little bit when I talked about transboundary water agreements. I'm a bit of an optimist, but if I look through history, I think there's a lot more examples of these types of collaborations that, as you say, often are developed by scientists, but actually also politicians and such, because water is a foundation for humanity, right? We can't live without it. So it's been a catalyst for peace despite conflict. And there's a lot of examples. I mean, Jordan and Israel. I talked about Pakistan and India. There's the Mekong region. Lots of examples.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I share your optimism. And I would say that, working collaboratively is so easy in academia. So the fractures don't exist that much, really. I mean, we may argue about little things here and there, but they're usually pretty small things. And so I sort of see academia as a great ecosystem, as an example of how collaboration is done and how you can get rid of fractures by sharing information, open data, and so forth. Mm. So yeah, I think I take the optimistic side as well.
Mm. So I have time for just one final question, and if you could speak to this briefly, and it has to do with the digital divide. How do we ensure, what are the responsibilities we have as privileged academics to ensure that all these innovations we just talked about really reach everyone, that everyone has a chance to benefit from it? So it's not just a digital divide, it's a technological divide, it's a biomedical innovation divide. What are our responsibilities, not just as individual researchers, but as an institution, a public institution at that, to ensure equity and fairness in how our technologies impact human lives?
I don't have a full answer to that question, but I can start. And I think it's just having everything as open as possible. Publish what you can openly. Have your data that aren't sensitive. Obviously personal data can't be open, but any data that you've collected that can be should be available to people globally. Use coding that is open access, so Python as opposed to MATLAB sort of thing. So that's where I would start.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say use the technology that we're able to invest in and use it to create global public goods that other countries or systems or communities are able to draw on who maybe don't have access to that but can still benefit from, whether it's a new evidence product or a new way of thinking or analysis, whatever it is, to be able to use that for the global public good and make it open.
Thank you. The last word?
I would say that we can do an awful lot on our side in terms of making data open, making data available, and trying to share as much as possible. But in the end, I think that legislation and governments play the most critical role here. And so unless that's in place, I think we're in trouble. And so we have to keep advocating for and pushing for equity at that level. I see that as the only way to make sure this actually happens.
Thank you so much, panelists, for this compelling insights you provided. And that concludes the first phase of the conversation. We'll take a short break, and when we're back, I'll be counting on the audience to provide us with some questions that the panelists will be happy to address. Thank you. Welcome back to the second half of the McMaster Dialogue. We've just had a very interesting discussion among the panelists on some of the critical questions on science, technology, and digital innovation. So at this point, I'd like to invite the audience to pose some questions to the panelists. So who's going to go first?
This is a question for Dr. Mike Wilson specifically. You had briefly mentioned the incorporation of AI into your evidence retrieval for policymakers. I'm wondering how your use and incorporation of AI has kind of changed as AI has been constantly developing over the past years in your presentation of evidence for policymakers.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. My foray into AI has been relatively limited, I would say, until now. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity moving forward with some of the investments I talked about globally. But the main way that we've used it in conducting an evidence synthesis is, let's say we do some large searches of many databases to find all the relevant studies on whatever the topic is. Let's say we get 10,000 search hits that normally we would have to go through one by one, and typically with two people doing it independently. With AI, it's now built into some platforms where as we review those results, it gets trained on what we're looking for, and then we'll eventually rank order what's most and least relevant. So we can then set decision criteria for where we can stop reviewing as humans, essentially, and investing our time in that for where AI is ranked as pretty low probability of being relevant to our review. And then we can move on to the more important stuff that requires more of the human analysis to look at the individual study results of a paper, pulling those together in a synthesis. Where I think the potential is, I'm not necessarily the expert in this part, but it's one of our working groups with the collaborative, is using AI to also help alongside that analysis piece to start doing things a little bit more efficiently and quickly, but still with the human intervention and for quality checks and analysis and contextualization.
Thank you very much. So who's the next person to ask a question? Yes.
One theme I was interested in throughout was governance. And how governance needs to be there alongside evidence as well. Or sorry, not governance, deliberation, and including diverse stakeholders in all of these initiatives. And I was interested in where you see deliberation being incompatible or contradictory with kind of the structural frames in which you're operating your solutions. For example, you brought up market and demand considerations as a largely as something that kind of constricts the direction of some solutions. And so, yeah, if you could comment on where you've seen deliberation and inclusion of different stakeholders be constrained by these more structural factors.
So I think here it's important to separate out sort of entrepreneurial efforts versus maybe academia and things that have more global reach. When it comes to entrepreneurial things, if you're not doing what the market demands, then you're done, right? So as soon as you decide that I'm going to pursue this, then you really need to make sure there's a market there that's interested in what it is that you're doing. And if there isn't, then you're finished. When it comes to other avenues, that's where I think that sort of this deliberation and discussion and interactions between different groups is more important, and also has where you have the opportunity to have more reach that way. So here I'm thinking, for example, again, government mandating certain implementations. If it's good, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. And so I think this is where governance really, really matters.
Yeah. I would agree largely with what you said. I think sometimes policies need to also be in place to make sure that, or to elevate voices, to make sure that all the appropriate stakeholders are considered. And you talked about our governments, I can't remember who said it, but our governments sort of having policies to be more open, to produce information and data for those, or to make it accessible to everybody. So
I can add to this a little bit as well. I think this is great. One of the key considerations for me is I do think deliberations are really important. And with deliberations, if you want system leaders to kind of find some common ground, you also have to ask, what are they going to base their deliberations on, or have their deliberations informed by? So if you want them informed by citizens' values and preferences, for example, then you need to think about what that process looks like. And for me, if you want to have a really solid understanding of citizens' values and perspectives, you have to take a systematic and transparent approach to try and engage citizens from all walks of life, take an equity-driven approach, hear many different perspectives, and try and pull that together thematically to inform a set of deliberations with those who are ultimately going to be either informing or making or championing decisions, whatever those may be. And having a space for those deliberations with those system leaders in a way where people feel free to speak their mind. So have an off-the-record set of deliberations. So you can have a government official and maybe a professional organization that might be at odds, but you could have them in the same room, have a common starting point, and try and find some common ground between them. And that's kind of part of our political decision-making processes, and those things all have to be balanced, but for me it's the inputs of the types of evidence that are going into that.
I think speaking of the balance, I was just thinking about what you were saying. Deliberation, I think, is also a place where good ideas go to die. So sometimes you can have just too much deliberation and not enough action, and that's what we also often see. Certainly, I see that in academia all the time. I think it's very common that there's lots of deliberation and very little action. And so I think this is where the balance is really, really important, right? When do you stop deliberating and start doing?
Yeah, it reminds me of the saying, paralysis by analysis.
Yes, exactly.
Effectively
Yeah.
paralyze the situation by overanalyzing it. Okay, so any other question? Yes, please.
Thank you for sharing your work and your ideas. It's very interesting. My question is about the topic which came up a few times, the open science, open coding, just being open and transparent. And one thing with that is also the potential harms that could be done with open data and open models and open information, essentially just through malicious intent of users and actors. So just interested to know if you have comments about how to open and be transparent while being also safe in these practices.
So you were the one who talked about the need for
I
us to
did.
be transparent and open.
I
So
do.
that's your question, I think.
Okay, well, I'll try to answer that. That's not an easy question to answer. So I think there's a need to have it open in part to ensure that it's not misused. And, I'm thinking of examples where, in the history of climate change science, where data were made up, they weren't real, and that caused a lot of problems. It actually caused a lot of the beginning, I think, of the climate science denial movement. So I think when data are open and transparent, in some ways you can prevent disinformation and misinformation. You're right, there's always going to be people who twist things with malicious intent, and I don't know that I have a good answer for you right now on how to prevent that. I'd need to think about it a bit more.
I guess on the other side of that is if it is open and available, fostering collaboration, that information is also there and available for fact checking and can be used very quickly and leveraging digital tools and AI for that purpose. So there's two sides to that piece, right? But the fact checking, again, to my earlier points, has to be accompanied with the ability to harness evidence and react to that misinformation really quickly, because that misinformation travels very, very quickly and it's easy to buy into. And so there has to be a balance with that. Again, I don't have a solid answer for you, but more, thinking about it on both sides.
Do you have?
Oh, I got nothing on this one.
Thank you for that question.
That was a very difficult question.
And it goes back to the point about really practicalizing some of these issues. You know, the concept is nice, but when you start thinking through, okay, what does this mean in terms of the practical implementation, it can be challenging. So thank you so much for that question. We need more questions. Okay, we'll take the man who has taken one. Yeah.
So the question I want to ask is about this issue of disinformation. We know we're at a time where the tech giants, they waste so much power and control when it comes to information. Recently, when Mark Zuckerberg actually released something that is quite controversial in terms of how they will manage disinformation or fact-checking. So I just want to know, what are your thoughts of regarding what we can do, both from a policy perspective and also from this is an academic environment. We have different scholars, and so what are your thoughts regarding what we can do to combat this issue of disinformation in a reality where there's so much power and influence by these tech giants? And I've been thinking about it. I want to know your thoughts about it. Thank you.
This is an excellent question and such an existential question right now. And I certainly don't have an answer to your question. I think the only thing I can provide in this is education. And so I just always come back to that. I mean, I have to, with the time that I have and what I do in my career, I can attack certain problems. And when we see this problem of misinformation, disinformation, how to tackle that, especially like you say with all the big tech giants and everything that we have right now, I think all I can do is do my best at educating people. And I take a lot of satisfaction in that, and also feel like that is a really important and exciting role to take, right? If people are educated, if people understand, then hopefully people can make good critical decisions. So that's the only thing I can say. I realize it's a very unsatisfactory answer because it's not that global. It's a small scale answer, but I do think that a lot of these problems have to be tackled at a small level.
I agree completely. I think it's education, and I think not only on particular issues, but just throughout, people's lives and careers about what are good information sources. How can I think about these things critically? And if we teach people from a very young age to do that, again, the optimistic side of me thinks that maybe we can get past some of this disinformation.
Absolutely. I mean, that long-term, over time, incorporating this into education, fact-checking, being critical of sources, thinking about where's good information, what's maybe not so good, but also from a government decision-making perspective. If I'm a government decision-maker, I have to think increasingly any policy decision also has to be informed by, in your implementation phase, what are we going to have to do to address misinformation about, potential misinformation about this policy decision. So that's now kind of a layer of another layer to an already complex process of having to make policy and political decisions too.
And I also wonder if there's a space for academics like us to play in the space of information. Obviously, we won't have the kind of resources that the big corporations have, but I'm thinking here of an organization like Mayo Clinic and its website that provides information. You knew that the information you got from the Mayo Clinic website was the most accurate medical information you could get. And in some ways, people knew that it's out there, and if I wanted the right information, I could go there. And I'm wondering if there's a space for institutions, universities, to aggregate, harness our power, our resources, a lot of intelligent people on these topics, and say, here's our own platform. You really want to get the truth on public health, on materials engineering, on groundwater research, this is where you go. Yeah, just a thought, but because it's a complex problem. How do you tackle misinformation, which grows by the day?
When there is evidence to suggest that things like credibility labeling or the source of information has an influence on addressing misinformation. And evidence coming from universities is typically viewed as being more trustworthy. So I think there is a big role to play for academia in addressing this, given the independence and trust that's accorded to many academic institutions.
I think that speaks to, though, the need for academics to translate their knowledge in a much more accessible way than we are currently, typically most of us do. So it's something to think about building into, building into our roles, really, right? Because right now it's primarily most of us publish in academic journals, which aren't super accessible, even if they're open.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have time for a couple more questions. Okay, we'll take someone who hasn't taken a question yet.
My question is just kind of a general question for everybody. It's been mentioned a couple times that there's some issues at the government and policy level with accessibility and openness to information. And I guess my question for you guys is just, what change do you want to see at that level, and what restraints are you feeling as researchers and as an institution in relation to the accessibility and openness to valid information?
I can start if you like. But I think one thing for me is that we invest a lot in innovations, like new things, new products, patents, those kinds of things. We also invest a lot in new research to evaluate things, many different forms of evidence. Where we don't invest a lot are in what I call evidence support systems, to take those innovations and the research about them and to help translate it into policy. So what I would like to see is more investment and focus on those evidence support systems that help work at the interface of all those research investments and the policy decisions that are made.
Yeah. And I guess what I would like to see is, when we do invest in something, for example, new research, to have policies in place so that the data that go along with that support it, have to be open, not only for fact checking, that's important too, but also if somebody has a different idea and this data can be useful as part of their work, that they can harness those data and use it for perhaps a different purpose than it was otherwise intended, and it's not lost in some professor's computer somewhere.
I think that here, tying back to something that Bonnie said about web pages from reputable places. I mean, I think things like that are excellent, but we need resources to be able to do these things, right? And so in the end, a lot of this also comes down to just having the resources to be able to do these things that we would like to be doing, right? I think I would love to spend more time creating a web page so I can disseminate the information that what we have learned in my research, for example, to a more general public. But when you add it to all the other things that you have to do, that becomes very difficult. So you have to prioritize, and I think that's a place where I think we can, policy can make a difference, having more resources available and encouraging universities to do more of this.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. A lot of conversation has been around access to data. I'd like to shift our attention slightly to access in technology technology transfer, because I think that's a huge problem talking about when we're talking about that divide. During COVID, most countries in the global south didn't have access to the COVID vaccine. And because of intellectual property restrictions, the formula couldn't be shared with countries to produce theirs. So as academics, we're involved in developing new knowledge, and most inventions come from taxpayers' money. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are around IP generation and reconciling that need to protect the inventor's right, at the same time thinking about the global good.
Good question.
Very, very difficult question. And I mean, what can I say? I mean, what we saw there, in my view, was just completely criminal, right? It's just inappropriate that information that was generated through support from taxpayers ends up in this way, where we can't share it in an equitable way. What are the solutions to that? I wish I had a good answer for you. I really don't. I mean, I think that some of it has to do with the way the markets work and the way entrepreneurial enterprises work. And obviously, things like open access to information goes a long way towards helping with these issues. And I mean, again, we were talking about being optimistic. I'm very optimistic and very hopeful that as we move forward, we don't repeat these same things that we've seen happening fairly recently. If I'm honest, I expect we'll see the same thing happen again, but I'm still going to remain optimistic that it doesn't.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is I think the biggest player in making change there has to be governments. I think governments and policies are the way to address that issue. I don't know how, but somehow.
Yeah, because responsibility for populations rests with governments. They're making system-level decisions that affect populations, whether it's a nation or globally or regionally within the world, and I think that's spot on.
Yeah, I think we may also add to that the whole idea that these are global challenges, whether it's the COVID pandemic, the virus, or the ethical use of artificial intelligence, or the spread of toxic information. These are global challenges that require a global response. So we can't be siloed in the way we share information and knowledge. You would hope that will persuade the policymakers to be more open. We have time for just one last question, and I saw your hands up right there, so we'll take that.
Okay, this one is more of a specific question for Dr. Dickson-Anderson, but I can expand it. You touched on for a moment the fact that despite international differences and conflicts, often agreements about water security and sharing water are kind of upheld in this interesting way. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what you thought about kind of what is why that is, and also if you think that there are any lessons to be taken from those negotiations when it comes to looking at advancing sustainability in other areas, in areas that might be considered a common, so air quality, environmental conservation, things like that. And then for the rest of the panel, if people want to touch in just any moments where you've seen people come together for a cause that you would consider to be in favor of the common good, and whether or not you see any applications of that one specific instance in other challenges that we're facing today in terms of international conflict and climate justice.
That's a big question. I think the examples that I've seen where transboundary water sharing agreements are a catalyst for peace are largely because people need water to survive. And always, for whatever reason, even countries who are in conflict have been able to come together and decide on ways to share the water such that no one has to go without. And I think it comes down to that. It comes down to human life. So think that's the catalyst. So if we want to think about other areas where there has to be major, international collaboration, I think maybe the climate crisis, and I think it's becoming more and more evident. Disasters are happening more frequently. They're larger. As we start to see people have to migrate because there is no water, or because, floods are happening too frequently, or whatever it may be, fires, I think when more and more human life depends on it, I think that's the point at which it will be a catalyst for everybody to get on board. We just have to hope that it's not too late.
I think that communication is critical in all of these things, and what you see here is that you have communication across boundaries, with people that have a vested interest in the same goal, that are working towards the same thing. And so that kind of communication, I think, is critical for breaking down boundaries. And so I'll give a small and very silly example here, okay? So I'm a physicist, and every year there's a big conference that happens usually in the US, where literally 10 to 15,000 physicists all come to one city to discuss various aspects of the research that you have done. So think about the fact that you've got students here, for example, students in my research group, that spend a ton of time preparing for their 10-minute talk to give at this conference. And then you have all these people coming together to discuss this work, to discuss it with each other, right? Boundaries are checked at the door, right? Nationalities don't matter here. And it just creates this wonderful microcosm, I think a microcosm of what it could be if we have more communication between people. So I think, like I said, it's a very silly example, but I think it's an example of how critical communication is in all of this.
Dr. Wilson, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that I agree climate action is probably one of those shared areas, and I think the other is pandemic planning and response. Yeah. Viruses don't observe borders. It can travel around the globe very quickly, as we've seen in very recent years. And my hope is that we can use what we learned on many fronts during the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that we have health systems, social systems, everything prepared for another pandemic response if such an issue were to come up again. And to know that it's not just a health issue, I think we now fully know that it is a health and societal issue where it requires responses from across the board with governments and across the board internationally with cooperation.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very productive and insightful discussion on this topic of science, technology, and digital innovation. The key takeaway for me is the need to strike that delicate balance between the benefits of technology we've heard so much about and making sure we're also paying attention to mitigating the risks of technology in terms of its impact on sustainability, in terms of the digital divide, and making sure that the benefits of technology are equitably shared amongst the community, and also the role of the university in ensuring that the technology that we develop serves the common good. And I'm particularly glad that you provided the example of the conference as one where, boundaries are checked at the gate, and the viruses that know no borders. These are incentives for collaboration, so to speak. It tells us that it is possible to have these kinds of collaboration. It remains for me to thank the panelists, Dr. Dalnoki-Veress, Dr. Dickson-Anderson, and Dr. Wilson, for what has been a very interesting and enlightening conversation, and to thank the students and staff who've joined us to be part of this conversation, and to David, our president, who initiated this dialogue and has supported it all through. We hope that this will be just the second in a series of dialogue, and we hope for your continued engagement in these dialogue series, the McMaster Dialogues, as they progress. Thank you very much.